Sourdough starter only needs 2 ingredients and time. Flour and water combined with a little warmth and patience yields a naturally occurring wild yeast. The only commitment on your part is feeding it and discarding the extra starter on a regular basis. We're talking only a few minutes a day, tops. There are so many yummy meals and snacks you can make and eat while you're making your starter and anticipating homemade sourdough bread. Check out my savory and sweet recipes links below for your sourdough discard. Depending on how well your starter grows and how attentive you are to the initial growth process, you can make homemade bread anywhere from 7 to 14 days. You have to remember that you are creating yeast from scratch, and that takes time as it needs to develop and reach complexity before making really good bread. That's not to say you can't make sourdough bread using your discard. With that, let's begin our starter from scratch. I'm actually going to show you the process from beginning to end and what your sourdough starter should look like at different stages. For the ingredients, all you need are water and whole wheat flour that you're going to use to start your sourdough starter on day 1. And then for the remainder days of feeding your starter, I like to use bread flour, but you can also use all-purpose flour. Bread flour has a higher ash content and of course higher gluten content, and it's great to produce that chewy sourdough bread as well as to help feed the starter, providing it the nutrients that it needs, which is why we start with the whole wheat flour. Here's what you do on day 1 in beginning your simple sourdough starter. Day 1, we make the starter. You'll need a medium of a quart-sized container. That could be a mason jar like this, or just a large bowl. I'm going to use a large bowl just because it's, for me, easier to mix everything in. You're going to add 120 grams of whole wheat flour. That equals 1 cup fluff scooped and leveled off. Whole wheat flour is important to use to begin the starter because it contains the whole grain that includes lots of nutrients to activate and feed the starter as it begins. To the flour, we're going to add 120 grams of water. This should be room temperature water. If it is cool, you can always heat it up in the microwave for 20 seconds to reach a little bit warmer temperature. And you want filtered water. The extra heat gives the mixture a jump start. If you don't have filtered water, you can use tap water, but plan ahead and allow it to set out overnight uncovered and on the counter to release any chlorine that may be present. Check the bottom, make sure you've gotten all the flour mixed in with the water. Having made lots of sourdough, the sourdough will rise and peak at the top of this bowl. Cover your container loosely with a lid, not to seal it tightly. We're going to allow the starter to sit at room temperature for at least 12 hours. If your house is too cool, you can place your starter in the oven with an incandescent light bulb on continuously to create about a consistent 80 degrees or so warm environment. So now we're on day 2, which is time to discard and feed the starter. After 24 hours, you may or may not see bubbles forming. If you don't see bubbles, allow the starter to remain untouched until you see bubbles. We are 24 hours later after starting our sourdough, and notice at day 2 it has doubled in size. Yours may or may not do this. If it hasn't, don't worry. Just let it continue to grow. We're going to feed it now because mine has increased in size. So notice how it's growing. Notice when I take my fork and I pull the dough away. It's really been working and really been rising. So we want to take out all but a half a cup of this, and I just eyeball it. I don't measure it out. So that's probably about half a cup right there. Okay, if it's a little bit more, it's not going to hurt anything. Okay, so we took out a little bit. You want to take out the discard and put it in a separate container. Put a lid on your discard container. You're going to store it in the fridge until you decide to use your discard. We're going to add to it every day. Hopefully we'll get rid of some of the discard by making some yummy food. Use the discard in making other recipes. See my links for the many options. You can store your discard in the fridge for a couple of days until you have enough to make something. You usually need about a cup. To our sourdough starter, you're going to add 120 grams. This time we're using bread flour. You could use all-purpose flour. And then we're going to add 120 grams, which is half a cup, of room temperature water. Just make sure everything gets stirred in. All that's left now is to loosely cover it. In the cold oven it goes with the incandescent light bulb on until tomorrow. Now we're at days 3 to 6 or more. It's time to discard and feed the starter. We're going to do this twice a day now, about 8 to 12 hours apart. Repeat day 2, discarding and adding flour and water after bubbling. You know when it's time to feed when the bubbling has peaked and your starter begins to sink. If you find that your starter is bubbling more quickly, 4 to 6 hours, then that just means you need to feed more often. As before, remove all but a half a cup of starter, just eyeball it, and then feed it 120 grams of flour and 120 grams of water. Welcome to day 3. During the night, my sourdough peaked at that top line and it has dropped since. When it drops after it peaks, that tells us that it's hungry and now it's time to feed it. Feed the starter when it's hungry only. Okay, notice we've got some bubbles on top, and then when I take my fork and I move it around, the bubbles start popping. So we're gonna give it a quick little stir. Love to see all those bubbles. That tells us it's working, and I can smell the tang, which is perfect. That yeast is developing. Add 120 grams of flour, and then we're gonna add 120 grams of water. I do heat my water up for 20 seconds in the microwave to get it to close to very warm. So I like mine under 100 degrees, and that 20 seconds in the microwave is perfect. You'll realize that I just forgot to discard part of my sourdough, but you know what? That's okay if you do that. The only reason why we discard is to keep it from growing so big. So this bowl is big enough, it can handle doubles in size. We'll discard later today. So we're good for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. Now we're gonna start feeding it 2 times a day. It's time for a second feeding. Notice I've got some water at the top. I've had some bubbles, so we're gonna go ahead and feed it. We're on day 4, the first feeding of the day. We had some bubbles overnight, but it didn't really grow much. So we're gonna go ahead and feed it anyway. It's the afternoon of day 5. It is bubbling, but it is still not mature and it's not doubling in size yet. So it's just time for a feeding. Okay, we're at the beginning of day 6. Have a little bubbles going, a little bit of growth, but not much. So we are still in the feeding process. We're on the evening of day 6, and this is the first significant growth we've had in our sourdough. This is where it was this morning. This is where it is 12 hours later. So it's time to feed it. We have some nice significant bubbles on top, and it's becoming a thicker substance. We're in the morning of day 7, 12 hours later, and our sourdough starter has risen a little bit. Not quite there yet to use as a sourdough starter, but it is growing. Bubbles are forming. Just slow process, so it's time to discard all but half a cup and then feed it. End of day 7, it's still growing, though it's not mature yet, so we're still going to feed it and continue to let it grow before we use it in a sourdough bread. Beginning day 8, notice it's almost doubling overnight now. Notice the bubbles on top. At this point, you could probably use it to make sourdough bread. And as we move the sourdough around, those bubbles are popping. So it's not completely mature yet, but it does have a rise to it. So let's go ahead and feed it. Check out this side-by-side comparison. I've been working on this sourdough for 3 weeks or so, feeding it twice a day. Notice how much it has matured. This sourdough, this is day 10 of this one. I started it in the same size bowl. They're identical bowls. I feed them the exact same amount. And notice how this one has still a little bit of maturity to go. You can make bread with either one of these. The one on the left, it has some nice bubbles. It has almost doubled in size overnight. The one on the right, lots of bubbles. Notice how quickly it deflated when I put my fork in there. Notice what I call the spider web effect on the opposite side there. That's how much it has grown and how airy it is. The yeast is really active. This is a mature sourdough, and this is perfect to use in any bread. Once they're deflated, they're the same size. Day 14 seems to be the magic day for this batch of sourdough starter to become mature. Notice where it was last night and where it is right now. It's a very mature looking sourdough. Take a look at all the bubbles and how much they're popping, and the spiderweb look when you move it away from the bowl, and notice how much it deflates when you stir it up. This sourdough starter is perfect for making sourdough bread. You can also tell by the texture. If the starter is thick, the mixture is still digesting and isn't hungry yet. If the mixture is liquidy and pourable, then it's hungry and has metabolized all the flour. Your starter is ready to use to make loaves of bread when it has doubled in size after feeding, but it should be a minimum of 6 days to ensure that your starter has lots of flavor and complexity, even if it's doubling at a quicker rate. If your mixture is growing too fast, place the mixture in a cooler environment to slow down the starter's metabolism. The mixture should continually smell slightly sweet with a little tang. When it is time to make your bread, ideally you'll feed it one last time 6 to 8 hours before using the starter to make the bread, since it will take about that long for the starter to reach its peak rise, though it may occur in 4 hours. To store your starter for later use, if you sort of just get tired of it and you need a break from the starter, don't throw it away. Store the starter covered in the fridge. Feed it the same day every week, discarding down to a half a cup, adding 120 grams each bread flour and water, or all-purpose flour. Continue this process until you're ready to bake again. Then allow the starter to sit out at room temperature for 1 to 3 days to reactivate. Remember to feed it 1 to 2 times a day until it's actively bubbly again. That's pretty much it. Time and patience are virtues in making a sourdough starter, but as long as you read your dough daily, even twice a day, and tend to its needs, you can make bread continuously for as long as you want. When you get tired of it, store it in the fridge and you'll always have homemade yeast to make bread. Thanks for watching. I hope my visuals and tips help, and see the links below for even more sourdough discard recipes. Until next time, go bake the world.